There's a famous saying in the Super Smash Bros. World, don't get hit. It's a nice sentiment, but in actual matches, the story tends to be a bit more complicated than this. However, with all that said, there is one archetype that truly lives or dies on this principle far more than any other. The frail, vulnerable, yet cataclysmically powerful Glass Cannon, a consistent performer since the earliest days of Smash. This episode of The Perils of Playing and Designing was voted on by my supporters, and if you'd like to make your voice heard for the next entry in the series, the poll is now open on my Discord server, available to all patrons, YouTube members, or Twitch subscribers. For today, though, we dive into the history of this fan-favorite archetype, what makes it tick, as well as the triumphs and perils of such a reckless design. But first, a word from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by AFK Arena, the intuitive, casual, yet strategic mobile online RPG. Featuring a unique fresco art style and Western fantasy setting, AFK Arena is the best RPG for busy you, allowing all the satisfaction and reward of collecting loot, fighting demons, upgrading heroes, and all your other favorite role-playing activities while skipping the grind and respecting your time. Participate in an epic adventure, using hero unions, factional advantages, and smart lineups and unit combinations to bolster a multitude of strategies. All of this within bite-sized chunks of time. Say, after fighting your third online Samus of the day and just needing a break for a minute. Take a breather, get some coffee, we've all been there. And what better to pair that coffee break with than AFK Arena? By downloading the game using the unique link in the description of this video, you can receive special in-game rewards while also supporting the channel. Thank you to AFK Arena, and start your journey today. As with most archetypes, glass cannons are based around a fundamental trade-off, in this case, gaining power in exchange for vitality. They universally hit extremely hard, racking up damage quickly and consistently killing earlier than many other characters would be capable of. Keep in mind that consistently is the key word here. The nature of platform fighters means that any character can score an early lead in the right scenario, but glass cannons have the tools needed to make this a routine part of their game plan. These are the source of their power, whereas vitality in platform fighters is generally expressed through a character's weight. And indeed, if we look at a list of classic examples of this archetype throughout the series, they do tend to have very low weights. This isn't necessarily universally true, however, as there are alternate ways to express vitality in this genre. Recovery is the most common one, with Little Mac being perhaps the most notorious example, although he is fairly light as well. Falco in Melee would be another example of this, who, despite actually weighing more than his clone Fox, is still more often cited as a glass cannon design due to his significantly shorter recovery distance. Vulnerability to taking damage could be considered a vitality trade-off as well. We can once again turn to Melee Falco, whose high fall speed makes him very susceptible to combos, or as an alternative, modern Mewtwo's large body and limited defensive options in the air. Character-specific mechanics with vulnerabilities could also be considered an expression of limited vitality. Again, Little Mac's KO punch fits the bill. However, you could make a similar case for, say, the second Ice Climber. While killing it doesn't take the Ice Climber's stock as a whole, the Ice Climbers do hit incredibly hard while they're both active, are vulnerable to having this strength taken away, and become quite weak when this happens. Does this mean that the Ice Climbers could qualify as a glass cannon design? What about Dr. Mario, who's an average weight but has one of the most vulnerable recoveries in the game and simultaneously hits extremely hard? He frequently kills very early, but the same could be said for his opponent, purely because of his recovery. So does he qualify? And if he does, what about Ganondorf? The King of Evil is even more destructive and more vulnerable to being KO'd early due to what may genuinely be the worst recovery in the game, and yet doesn't equating this and this just feel slightly off? Ganondorf is obviously a very heavy character, which directly opposes the vitality trade-off principle. However, his recovery is legitimately so horrendous that his theoretical survival factor frequently doesn't actually actually come into play. He's also clearly a textbook example of the heavyweight archetype, however, that doesn't necessarily create a direct conflict, as the glass cannon label has a limited ability to describe a character's playstyle alone. It typically needs to be combined with another category. You can have a sword fighter glass cannon, a floaty glass cannon, a jack of all trades glass cannon, a rushdown glass cannon. Which characters get glass cannon as their primary designation, or really any designation at all, is, at the end of the day, largely a matter of opinion. That said, in my case this opinion tends to align with what I'd imagine the spirit of the character was intended to be. So I'd personally call Dr. Mario a glass cannon. The developers clearly looked at Mario's recovery and intentionally destroyed its range in exchange for a boost to launch power, tying nicely into the power for vitality trade-off. Whereas I wouldn't quite consider Ganondorf or the Ice Climbers to fit the title, even if there are overlapping characteristics. That said, I think you could make a case for any or none of them to fit into this archetype. And a well-known archetype it is at that, as the various Smash titles have frequently featured at least one glass cannon in the upper echelon of their tier lists. Smash 64 features Kirby, Melee has Falco and Jigglypuff, Brawlhalla as the rare Zoner glass cannon. Smash 4 features a host of them, including Zero Suit Samus, Fox, Mewtwo, and arguably any of Cloud, Bayonetta, or Rosalina depending on what you personally consider the definition to be, and Ultimate continues that trend with Chrom and arguably his source character Roy, Fox, Mr. Game & Watch, as well as the pre-patch versions of Pichu and Olimar, both of which were legitimate candidates for the best character in the game before being toned down. Captain Falcon has also had a consistent presence throughout the series, although I'd personally consider him on the fringes of being a glass cannon rather than actually fitting the role. His recovery has consistently been a bit too versatile and his weight a bit too high. Now, by all means, being a glass cannon doesn't automatically set you up for success. For example, Little Mac and Jigglypuff are two quintessential expressions of the archetype who have both had rocky roads throughout the series, but overall, it does trend towards one of the more successful archetypes across the Smash titles. Some of this is absolutely due to the inherent virtues of the power for vitality trade-off, which will tend to more consistently reward the better player than if the reverse were true. We discussed the merits of placing the onus on yourself rather than your opponent in the last episode of this series, but a lot of it also correlates to the other archetypes that tend to be associated with them. As mentioned, glass cannons are typically fairly small and light, which in Smash tends to be paired with high mobility and speed, a classic concept stretching far outside the boundaries of platform fighters. This means that the most common accompanying archetypes for glass cannons tend towards Rushdown or Jack of all trades, which, if we take a look at a list of top-tier characters throughout the series, are clearly represented disproportionately. Multifaceted toolboxes, good mobility, and fast frame data are consistently extremely valuable traits to have in this game genre. On top of that, not only do the glass cannons that fall into these camps tend to do well competitively, but they also tend to be more well received by the respective game's player base. Let's go back to that intro phrase. Don't get hit. It goes without saying that every character, except arguably Lucario, is going into a match intending to land blows while avoiding them in turn. But glass cannons are the ones that most strongly exaggerate the impact of winning or losing any given neutral exchange. An ideal glass cannon maintains a stable balance between these incentives for both the player and their opponent. And historically, if this balance starts shifting too far in any given direction, we've seen cracks in the design start to appear. Melee Jigglypuff is an infamous example of this, a character whose design overemphasizes the ability to avoid getting hit. Little Mac would be another example, except in this case his opponent is the one who's empowered to avoid getting hit on any stage with platforms. And in Smash 64, where the massive hitstun and poor defensive options give the entire roster glass cannon tendencies, we tend to see the same kind of passive neutral appear, often one of the biggest criticisms levied at this game's competitive scene. To be clear, some people still do have fun with this title, along with all the characters mentioned, but if the design goal of creating a platform fighter includes a diverse roster that people overwhelmingly enjoy playing against, and watching others play, I think it could be reasonably said that these aren't ideal expressions of the archetype. In my eyes, the most successful glass cannon designs follow two core ideals. They can force interactions, but lack the tools or incentive to avoid interactions. Melee Falco illustrates this premise well, with his lasers and powerful air game making it difficult for most of the roster to gain anything from staying away from him. At the same time, Falco is forced to stand and fight once his opponent does navigate through the lasers, and again, because of how potent his close quarters tools are, this was generally his primary goal to begin with. We can also take a look at Chrom in Ultimate. combat. He's highly mobile and has large hitboxes, which makes avoiding him unrealistic for most characters. At the same time, while he does have the mobility to avoid interactions entirely with slower members of the roster, there isn't really anything in his kit that rewards him for doing so unless the player is intentionally going for a timeout strategy, which are uncommon to begin with and don't line up with this particular character's strengths. In fact, the kind of movement likely required to execute this strategy only opens him up to potential comebacks. If there was a Chrom player out there who was desperate to use a timeout strategy, it might be on the very fringe of viability, but clearly isn't the way the character is designed, and in practice is essentially unheard of. Of course, another reason both these designs are so successful in their respective games is that they absolutely live up to the canon alongside the glass, being granted extensive combo games and outrageous kill moves which allow the player to feel appropriately rewarded for taking on the archetype's risks. These are two fairly textbook examples, but I could certainly point to others, such as Ultimate Pichu, who possesses the mobility to force interactions and hits like a truck, but also has a very high incentive to close stocks as quickly as possible due to its self-damaging characteristics. Every missed attack or defensive projectile only putting it on a tighter clock. Glass cannons create a fantasy of high-octane, kill-or-be-killed combat, and the characters that I've highlighted here strongly support that fantasy, which, while not the only pillar that supports a good character design, is certainly one of them. It's an easy archetype to tune in the wrong direction, but when the stars do align, it's obvious why the glass cannon has become a fan favorite combat style in Super Smash Bros. That's not to say there aren't more ideas to be explored though, as we can easily see if we take a glimpse at some other platform fighters. Rivals of Aether, for example, features some of the same rushdown or jack-of-all-trades approach that the Smash series has largely aligned with, but also arguably puts Abza into that camp. An interesting zoner hybrid with elements of Mewtwo, Zelda, and even Pikachu opening up her options considerably. In the upcoming Rushdown Revolt, meanwhile, the team pulls the trigger on the heavyweight glass cannon concept we referenced earlier, with the game's creator considering grappler Erda to be the glass cannon of that title. Slayers for Hire takes a wildly different approach with the Slugger, a bizarre sword fighter item hybrid character centered around tricky movement and interactions with his baseball, while Slap City's Asha discards traditional speed in exchange for a meter-based teleportation ability, a very powerful tool that recharges both from dealing and taking damage, highly encouraging the classic glass cannon no-holds-barred playstyle. When looking at some of these examples, there's obviously still a huge amount of design space to be explored for this archetype. One concept that I've always wanted to see personally is a character that plays around with their own health. We've seen self-damage, we've seen reward for being damaged, and we've seen life leech style moves. But what would happen if you put them all on the same character? The amount of balancing and fine-tuning needed to make this work would likely be extremely high, but if you wanted a high-risk, high-reward fighter with a ton of snap decision-making, that would certainly be a way to do it. That's just one example of many directions you could explore, but clearly, a fighter in this archetype doesn't need to be fancy to be effective. Create a glass cannon that leads to high-stakes, exhilarating combat, and you'll probably have a roster member beloved by fans around the world. And whether you're using this beloved character or playing against it, just remember one vital phrase: don't get hit. Thanks for watching, everyone, and hey, if you liked it, why not leave a like? As a reminder, the poll for the next archetype covered on this series is now open on my Discord server, available to all patrons, YouTube members, or Twitch subscribers. On the topic of Twitch, I stream there under MockRock Twitch, one word, including viewer battles when creating videos like this. Some of the clips shown in this video were captured during Glass Cannon exclusive sessions. Let me know your thoughts on glass cannons, and be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more videos like this. Later, people! I'm gonna blow your mind a little bit here. I really like Super Smash Bros. However, I think we can all admit that they haven't been flawless over the years by any means. So, quick update. Archetypes are an endlessly interesting topic of discussion, and one that people seem to latch onto in particular is the destructive, wrecking ball-like force of a good heavyweight. I should know.